and thank you for joining us for this webinar to launch our new research report on environmental justice in Ireland and our associated environmental justice resources for communities and schools that you saw in the video as you joined the webinar this morning. My name is Diarmuid Torney. I'm an Associate Professor in the School of Law and Government at Dublin City University and the Co-Director of DCU's Centre for Climate and Society. I'm delighted to welcome you all this morning. In particular, I would like to extend a warm welcome and thanks to Joe O'Brien, TD, Minister of State with the responsibility for community development and charities, who has kindly agreed to launch our report and resources this morning. I will introduce Minister O'Brien shortly, but before doing so, I'd like to give some background to the project and outline some of our key findings. The project is a collaboration between Dublin City University and Community Law and Mediation, an independent community law centre and charity established in Coolock in 1975. In many ways, it was an ideal partnership for this project. Not only are we geographical neighbours in North Dublin, but we share many of the same values. CLM, about which you will hear more later this morning, assists more than 4,000 people each year in communities experiencing disadvantage through free legal advice, advocacy, mediation, and community education services. For our part in DCU, we have a strong commitment to tackling disadvantage and promoting inclusion in education. We have the largest and longest standing access to education programme of any university in Ireland. We have strong links to the North Dublin community and pride ourselves on being a place-based university. Furthermore, climate change and environment are increasingly prominent themes in our research and our teaching. In recent years, we have, for example, launched master's and undergraduate degrees in climate change and environmental sustainability. So when the opportunity arose for DCU to collaborate with CLM in the area of environmental justice, we jumped at it. Our research project was funded by the Irish Research Council's New Foundations funding scheme, and I would like to thank the IRC for funding the research that we're presenting today. I would like to thank and acknowledge as well my colleagues on the project, lead author of the research report, Sive O'Neill, and contributing authors Cort Gleeson, Sinead Mercier, Clodagh Daly, and Rose Wall. I would also like to thank in particular Elizabeth Devine in CLM for her work in organising this morning's launch. Our study is the first of its kind to investigate key concepts and debates in environmental justice and how they relate to Ireland insofar as data is available. Our report finds that there is a significant gap in information correlating environmental data with spatial distribution of disadvantage and social exclusion. For example, the Environmental Protection Agency's 2020 State of the Environment report failed to adequately consider the social and distributional impacts of environmental degradation and loss of biodiversity. Our study also finds that low-income communities and marginalised groups perceive themselves to be largely excluded from environmental and planning decisions. Participants at a workshop hosted by CLM as part of the project expressed frustration with consultation processes, where the final decisions often sidelined their concerns. Legal costs and the lack of civil legal aid are significant barriers to public participation in environmental decision-making. Among our other key findings are that rising energy costs will lead to increased energy poverty in the absence of additional income supports and retrofitting programs. There is very little research on the impacts of air pollution on specific age groups and communities that experience high rates of energy poverty and traffic pollution. Transport poverty exacerbates inequality and deprivation by locking people who cannot afford a car out of jobs, public amenities, and other services. Travellers experience particularly high levels of energy poverty and health inequalities. Flood damage disproportionately hurts low-income households. Migrants experience barriers to participation and discrimination and are excluded from environmental decision-making. The housing crisis has multidimensional impacts on low-income and vulnerable communities, not least the effect of gentrification and better public amenities driving up rent costs. And environmental justice is also a question of political accountability, such as where laws are passed but not implemented. In our report, we set out key recommendations to improve monitoring of environmental pollution and its correlation with measures of deprivation and vulnerability, as well as to strengthen the pursuit of environmental justice in Ireland. We recommend improved data collection and information provision, improved access to environmental justice by ensuring that civil legal aid is available to community and environmental groups, support and proper resourcing for community engagement. We also recommend a new legal framework for environmental rights, a national policy statement on environmental justice that should be applied by all public bodies in their decision-making functions, and a mechanism to ensure that all climate and energy policy decisions are fully poverty-proofed. The executive summary and full report are available on the CLM website at the URL that is being shared in the Zoom chat on this webinar. The environmental justice resources for communities and schools that we developed as part of the project are also available there. And I would encourage you all to engage with these materials once our discussion this morning has concluded. We would also welcome your feedback on the report and the resources. You may be aware that we had hoped to be able to gather together in person for this morning's launch. However, with the rising case numbers in recent weeks, we decided last week that the most prudent course of action in the current circumstances was to move the launch online. We hope that in doing so, it will make the launch accessible to a wider audience. And we thank you all again for joining this morning. We hope also that we will all be able to meet in person in the near future. I would encourage those of you on Twitter to tweet about this morning's proceedings using the hashtag Voices of Environmental Justice. I would now like to introduce Joe O'Brien TD, who is Minister of State at the Department of Rural and Community Development with special responsibility for community development and charities. He previously held a seat on Fingal County Council before being elected as a Green Party TD to represent Dublin Fingal in 2019. He was re-elected to that position in February 2020. Before entering politics, Minister O'Brien worked with young people at risk and worked for more than a decade at Cross Care in the area of migrant rights. For 3 years before entering the Dáil, he worked for the Immigrant Council of Ireland. I'm sure you'll agree that he is therefore ideally placed to speak to the themes of our project. Minister, thank you very much again for joining us this morning. I give you the floor.
Thank you very much.
Minister, you've gone back onto mute.
I'm back on mute, and I thought I was being clever there to make sure I wasn't muted. Thank you for that, Diarmuid, and good morning, everyone. It's a pity we can't do this in person. COVID has caught us again, but I think we are reaching more people today online than we would have had with an in-person event. So I look forward to the discussion here this morning. I'm going to try to stay for as much of the panel discussion as I can. I can't guarantee I'll be there for all of it. And just to acknowledge the panelists as well, who will begin the session when I finish. Sive O'Neill, lead author of the report and assistant professor at DCU School of Law and Government. Dr. Rosaleen McDonough, Commissioner for the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. Austin Campbell of Robert Emmert's Community Development Project, Emer Manning, Environmental Programme Coordinator with the National Youth Council of Ireland, and Mark Murphy of the Irish Heart Foundation and the Climate Health Alliance. Also, again, just to acknowledge the Irish Research Council who funded the research, and of course those involved from DCU and CLM, including Diarmuid, Rose Wall and Clodagh Daly. And also, I think importantly as well, Owen Whelan, the illustrator who created the excellent resources that you may have seen at the start with Clodagh Daly of CLM as well. So I do very much welcome this publication. I understand how important it is that we as a society have ongoing conversations about the urgent need to transition to a more sustainable, climate-friendly way of life, and how we do that in a just and a fair and an equitable way to ensure that the vulnerable and marginalised groups are not disproportionately impacted. The report does, in many respects, does what it says on the tin and lays out the key dimensions of environmental and climate injustice experienced by vulnerable and marginalized groups. And I genuinely think it's going to be one of those reports that over time you will see consistently referenced, and one that I think will spur other pieces of work and research. And indeed, the report itself calls for other research in the area as well. And I think it's just worth stating the four overarching areas that the report examines in the area of environmental injustice in Ireland. So firstly, public participation and exclusion, impacts on vulnerable and marginalised communities, public services, and finally, marginalised voices. So I think the report is situated in a very important space. It's at the cross-section of environmental and climate change issues and social justice issues. It's a space I think that's under-examined, sometimes misunderstood, yet vitally important. And personally, for me, it's very important, and I was especially delighted to be asked to speak at this event. As a child, I had an interest in nature and wildlife that perhaps confounded my parents, and I know my father was perplexed at seeing me walking around the farm with my binoculars trying to identify birds in the trees. But my interest changed, I think, as I grew to more social justice issues, to the point where really for me the pursuit of and the cause of social justice became a driving force for me. And as Diarmuid mentioned, I've worked with young people at risk, I've worked in homeless services, areas of minority and migrant rights for a long time. And then my view kind of widened, I suppose, to the wider environmental context. I was drawn to what I saw as and still see as the holistic approach of green politics. So that's just a personal explainer why I'm genuinely delighted to be launching a report that's in this space. Also, just for purposes of clarity, I think it might be useful for me to outline very briefly my functions. I have functions in two government departments, mainly based in the Department of Rural and Community Development. I oversee a lot of the community development side of the house in the Department of Rural and Community Development, but I also have a foot in the Department of Social Protection, and it's also relevant for today's event as well. I oversee the Roadmap for Social Inclusion and the Employment Activation Programmes, Community Employment, Rural Social Scheme and TOOS. So in terms of the next few minutes, what I give will be a bit of a mix of some reaction to the report, but largely mentioning relevant pieces of work that I think will offer some hope and channels for progress in terms of some of the issues that have been raised in the report that we're launching today. And just to kick off, two other very relevant reports connected to my departments. Firstly, the 5-year strategy on supporting the community and voluntary sector, and it's called Sustainable, Inclusive, Empowered Communities. And it's got very important commitments around supporting the community and voluntary sector in the area of climate action. And then secondly, briefly, our new strategy for rural Ireland, or Rural Future, has also got especially clear commitments on climate action. And I think both of these strategies are especially strong also in their linkages to the Sustainable Development Goals, which I think are also very relevant to today's discussion. But then drilling down a little bit, I'd first like to talk about public participation networks. So I have responsibility for national policy and supports for public participation networks. There are 31 in each, we've got one in each local authority. Almost 18,000 community groups across the country are currently registered with their local PPN. And the PPN's primary function is to represent the community sector in local authority policy-making structures, giving local people a greater say in local government decisions. And the report we're discussing here today defines environmental justice to include the degree to which individuals and communities most vulnerable to environmental risks can access and participate in relevant decision-making processes. And I think this is an area where the PPNs can play a key role in terms of climate justice and environmental justice. The Environmental College in the PPN structure has previously been, I think, the poor cousin in local structures in terms of numbers of environmental groups involved, but this has been changing in recent years, and there are an increasing number of local community-based environmental groups that are members of PPNs. And I think the PPNs are in particularly important places in the context of today's report, as they are community-based. They do facilitate participation in local decision-making, but they also bring together the three colleges of environmental, social inclusion, and the C&V sector as well. I would say that relatively speaking, PPNs are a new structure. They are still developing, but they have already proven themselves to do valuable work. And I will be publishing a review of the operation of PPNs in the coming months to see how we can support PPNs to work even better and more effectively. And then also importantly, in the process of the development of the Climate Action Bill last year, now Act, I pushed strongly for inclusion of PPNs in the development of local climate action plans. And we now have an obligation in law on local authorities to consult with local PPNs in the development of their local climate action plans. I think I can hear some people thinking that consultation is fine, but it needs to be meaningful consultation. And I very much agree. But I am glad to say that I plan to commission a piece of research into barriers that are preventing people from marginalized backgrounds from participating in their local PPN. And once these barriers are identified, we will take action to help remove or mitigate them and give marginalized people fuller access to local decision making on environmental and climate policies. Another related and relevant key project for my department in rural community development this year is supporting local community development committees to develop and test strategies which help them to meaningfully engage with hard-to-reach communities in planning and decision-making processes using the local economic and community plan process. And the learnings from those pilot projects will inform the development of toolkits that could be scaled up and used by planning and decision makers to ensure that consultation is more than a tick box exercise. So I just wanted to make that point about the PPNs up front, because I think it's one of the more relevant pieces in terms of the findings of the report as well. And ultimately, we want to create plans and objectives that are informed, sustainable and impactful, and where all individuals and communities can see their interests, needs and opportunities reflected, and that doesn't always happen. Then secondly, I'd like to touch on the Community Climate Action Fund. Earlier this year, Minister Ryan and myself launched the fund, and I very much emphasised the need to potential applicants to come forward with proposals in the area of climate justice and just transition. This is an annual fund, it's €5 million this year. We had a total of 72 applications were received in response to the call, and they're currently being assessed. And then also to flag that there will be an even larger strand to come under this fund later this year, €24 million being provided to local authorities to develop partnership projects with local communities to help them build their low carbon communities. So local development companies working on the ground and other organisations working on the ground with communities will also play a key role in the development of these partnerships, I think. And again, I would strongly encourage projects in the area of climate and environmental justice to make applications to local authorities when the fund opens. Third thing I would like to mention, and it's one of my big things and one of the programs I'm most proud of, is that I oversee the Social Inclusion and Community Activation Program. It's called SICAP. We need to come up with a better acronym for it. But this is basically, it's a dedicated government program aimed at working with marginalized individuals and communities. In essence, it's over 600 community workers that are employed by local development companies across the country. And it's a program that's expanding because we got a 10% budget increase last year. And while ostensibly its focus is on the issues of social disadvantage and social exclusion, it's very interesting to note that I think at a grassroots level, natural connections are actually being made in SICAP between social justice and environmental issues. And I just wanted to share with you some points from 2021. A number of the local development companies delivering SICAP listed actions with an environmental focus, such as providing and maintaining community green spaces, such as community gardens and allotments, raising awareness and taking practical steps to mitigate climate change and loss of biodiversity, raising awareness of and seeking to mitigate the impact of climate change on vulnerable groups, so extremely relevant, and support for communities to become sustainable energy communities and to develop community energy plans. So this is a social inclusion program, but you can see there are environmental justice issues already coming from the bottom up in that regard. The current iteration of the program finishes up at the end of next year. I think it's very timely that this year we will be starting the process of developing the next iteration, which will run from 2024 to 2028. And I feel this report will have important points to make in terms of that process as the local development companies feed into the process. Fourthly, I wanted to touch on my responsibilities in the Department of Social Protection. By the way, if I'm running crazily over time here, Rose, shout and I'll cut short, but I'll try to be as quick as I can. I oversee the roadmap for social inclusion. I'll cut short here because I know I'm talking a lot. We're going to be reviewing that this year. It was published in January 2020, pre-COVID, but also importantly, pre-program for government, a program for government that's exceptionally green. So I think it's important that we review that. That process will be happening this year. And again, I mention it because there will be an opening there for input on the public in terms of how we maybe reframe a little bit of the roadmap for social inclusion. I do also want to mention as well, and it's relevant to the programme for government, the last two budgets, and this is touched on in the report, the last two budgets since the new programme for government has come into place have ensured that increases in carbon tax revenues have gone to those most in need via key welfare payments, but also retrofitting and supports for climate-friendly farming. And the last two budgets have been confirmed to be progressive in nature by the ASRI in terms of wealth redistribution. I also wanted to flag that this Social Inclusion Forum, this is hosted by the Department of Social Protection. It's an annual event. It provides people experiencing poverty and exclusion and community organisations representing them to come together and meet myself and Minister Humphreys as well to discuss the realities of poverty and related issues of common concern. And I expect this year we'll be having it in a couple of months' time. Cost of living, energy costs, energy poverty will be very, very high on the agenda. So I wanted to flag that again as another channel. Those were kind of some of the big bits. I'm going to touch briefly on some other bits as well. The retrofitting plan, I think, is important to mention, and particularly the focus on social housing stock as well. That's progress. I think I would like to see more done in that regard, particularly in relation to social housing stock and people renting as well. Just as a piece of information, Department of Environment, Climate and Communications will have a review of its implementation of the strategy on energy poverty that will be coming out later this year as well. I did also want to flag, because it's in the report as well, we have seen a huge shift in the spending on new transport infrastructure towards public transport and active travel. And I mention it because I was involved in the process of it in the negotiation programme for government as well. It is very significant. It may not be fully visible yet, but it is beginning to be so. And I did also want to flag, which doesn't get much attention, there is a strong commitment in there as well to improve public transport, in particular rural bus services in rural Ireland as well. And the Connecting Ireland plan is quite ambitious in that regard. We have a small scheme in here in the Department of Rural Community Development under our community services programme that is opening up access to bikes, but also training in bike repair to people from disadvantaged communities as well. So again, it's an attempt to join two areas of social exclusion and environmental justice together a little bit. And then some final points before I conclude. I do also think that when we speak of environmental and climate justice, it's very important that we situate it in the global context, and the global context of Ireland being one of the highest per capita emitters of carbon in the world, and the reality of climate change in the developing world, where it is in essence taking livelihoods and lives through extreme weather events. So the urgency to act is extreme, I think, and our action must be fast. I want to give particular note to two areas touched on in the report that I think are really important: flooding and flood risk. I think we're going to see a lot more of it. I've been in touch with CLM on an issue related to this. I think we're going to see a lot more of this, particularly for disadvantaged communities as well. And also, I was very glad to see planning being spoken about. And in many, I chair an interdepartmental group on food poverty, and planning actually is coming up indirectly quite a bit. We have lots of housing estates on the edge of towns that don't have access or transport access or any kind of access to accessible and nutritious food as well, because of where they've been located. It's also an issue for isolated homes and older people in rural Ireland as well. So those are my main comments. I'm going to start concluding now. And this is a bit of food for thought, and I think it's an important point to make. I do think we have a job of work to do to bring the two areas more together, the social justice side of things, environmental justice side of things. People on the margins of society do not generally see or understand their situation as one of environmental injustice, which is why this report is particularly important. And it's important that we get it out there more. I think there is a particular potential to spread the perspective and language of environmental justice in the community and voluntary sector. And I don't say this as an abdication of responsibility of government to do the same, but the community and voluntary sector has been a leader and a first mover in Ireland and abroad on environmental issues, but also on social justice issues. And I think today evidences that it's a first mover in the area of environmental justice as well. I know Community Work Ireland has also done some good work in this area. Obviously, CLM is moving moving fast, sorry. But there's also an excellent piece of work done by Task on the people's transition in Ardara and Phibsborough as well that I'd just like to draw attention to. And this was an approach that was very much supported by a grassroots bottom-up approach to climate justice that I would very much support. And I do believe there are supportive government frameworks that can help grow the environmental justice perspective as well. And just to conclude by saying, I would be very open to meeting again, maybe in a more focused setting, and perhaps workshopping some of the recommendations and see how we can bring more of the perspective of environmental justice into the work of government as well. But final word, congratulations to all involved. I really do think it's a very important piece of work, and I'm delighted to launch it today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, and thank you for those very thoughtful observations and indeed the information. I'm particularly interested to hear that government will be looking at the strategy on energy poverty this year, which is long overdue, but also to hear about the research being carried out on participation, barriers to participation for marginalised communities. So I'd be very interested to see and learn from that report. Community Law and Mediation have been delighted to partner with DCU on this project, which was, as Jibrin mentioned, resulted in both a research report on environmental justice in Ireland and 2 environmental justice resources for communities. In setting up the Centre for Environmental Justice just over a year ago, it was very clear to us in CLM that there was a paucity of data in the area of environmental justice in Ireland, and this has very much been confirmed by the report. It was also clear to us that the connection between inequality and the environment is not always immediately obvious, which is why the resources which we are launching today alongside the research report, and which were displayed through a slideshow before the event commenced, set out the links between housing and health, priority issues for communities, and the environment. CLM has been working with communities experiencing disadvantage for almost 50 years, and we see very clearly issues of environmental injustice in our work. How inequality and disadvantage can result in unequal access to environmental benefits like green space, and unequal impacts from environmental harms like pollution and climate change. But also how there are barriers to low-income communities and marginalised groups participating in environmental and planning decisions, and in holding those who are not fulfilling their environmental obligations to account. Through our legal advice clinics and our community engagement and training, we hear stories of people unable to afford their energy costs and serious health impacts arising from substandard accommodation and poor access to sanitation and clean water. We also hear of a lack of enforcement in relation to environmental wrongs, loss of homes and homelessness as a result of coastal erosion and flooding, and lack of access to green space and amenities. We are in the midst of both an inequality crisis and a DOL-declared climate and biodiversity emergency. What the report makes clear is that there is very little data on the intersection of the two. 2 years into a critical decade where the transition to decarbonisation is already underway, there's a real risk that environmental action will disproportionately impact marginalised groups instead of striving to address inequality. A key element to preventing this happening is to ensure that communities can participate in decisions that affect them and can seek accountability when environmental obligations are not met. The importance of hearing from the communities is reflected throughout the report, where the contribution of workshop participants on the issue have been included. One participant said, "Environmental conditions just impact on absolutely every aspect of people's lives, and it's completely linked to the kind of wealth levels in a particular area." Another commented, "So there's already that anxiety with the groups that we work with, that what is going to happen as the world is going more green. There are some communities that cannot keep up with that. They cannot afford to become more green, and so they feel excluded from that conversation." And another summarised some of the real difficulties that prevent certain communities from engaging on environmental issues. You have people that are up against so many other compounding things all at once, like if you don't know, will I have a job next week? Where can I pay rent? Or I might be evicted, or my roof is leaking. And when people are continuously left in these situations, it becomes difficult to engage in some of the processes of change because they're up against a million walls all at once. I'd like to explore some more of that reality of environmental justice in Ireland now, and I'm delighted to be joined by our panellists who represent and/or do amazing work in communities who experience environmental injustices. So I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Rosie McDonough, who is a writer, a member of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, and a member of the Traveller community. Rosaline worked in Pavey Point Traveller and Roma Centre for 10 years, managing the Violence Against Women programme, and remains a board member. She also holds a PhD, has written several plays, and is a regular contributor to the Irish Times. I'd like to also welcome Austin Campbell, who is an Executive Director of the Robert Emmet Community Development Project, an organisation based in southwest inner city Dublin that provides a wide array of programmes to best serve local community members. Austin formerly worked in homelessness services and is the co-founder of My Streets Ireland. Mark Murphy is with us today. Mark Murphy is the Advocacy Officer with the Irish Heart Foundation. Mark oversees and leads the organisation's work in environmental health and coordinates and manages the work of the Climate and Health Alliance, which is made up of 18 public health organisations and advocacy groups from around the island of Ireland. I'd like to welcome too Emer Manning, who is the Climate Justice and Youth Development Officer at the National Youth Council of Ireland. In addition to working on the Council's climate justice initiatives, she also promotes the importance of youth inclusion and a youth-led approach, particularly in relation to policy that directly impacts current and future generations of young people. And finally, I'd like to welcome Sive O'Neill, who is Assistant Professor at the School of Law and Government at DCU and is the lead author of the report. We have a really amazing bunch of people here today and I have lots of questions, but unfortunately, given time constraints, I'll only be able to ask each panelist 2 questions and I'm going to be really annoying and ask the answers be limited to 4 minutes each. The time constraints unfortunately also mean that we don't have time for Q&A from attendees, but if you have reflections, comments or information you'd like to share, please do use the chat box. So jumping straight into Rosaline first. Rosaline, environmental justice may be understood as the responsibility of government to ensure equitable access to healthy living environments. Do you think the government is holding up its end of the bargain in relation to this?
Good morning, Rose and Minister and the rest of the panel. Before responding to your question, first of all, Minister, I love the barrel top wagon picture. Very important. Rose, just as a disabled person, we saw what happened in Glasgow in January, where a disabled parliament member was excluded from a climate change conference. And there is a huge concerning issue about the gap between and the lack of dialogue with disabled-led NGOs and climate change activism. So we need to be aware. And yes, I'm one of those people who uses a straw. It's not always easy to get recycled or sustainable straws, but that's just one tiny element where there is a conflict around climate change and human rights for disabled people. I'm also delighted with the report and delighted to see travellers and other ethnic minorities highlighted, particularly issues around sustainability, safety, and climate change. I think when there are ever-present difficulties with traveller accommodation and a relationship with some local authorities, I would say that there's still quite a fair amount for local authorities to engage with travellers, not just on climate change issues, but also on pressing issues around clean water and safe environments. All these elements feed into the overall climate change issue. But the Minister mentioned in his address the way that we tend to live our lives in a very immediate way by responding to immediate practical issues, and that climate change and environmental issues are kind of secondary to how we respond to those issues. And I would say we have to kind of condense our responses so that climate change and access are part of the response. Rose, I won't be responding to your second question because I think we're running out of time. But my closing comment would be two things. There has been a perception that climate issues and indeed climate activism is seen as a very middle class issue. So I'm delighted that Ballymun Law Centre and DCU have done the report. I just hope that some of your, if not all, some of your recommendations will be implemented. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Rosaleen, and for sharing your insights and your experience with us. And that's something that we see in CLM a lot, and we've seen in the report that feeling of exclusion from participation and that feeling that your voices aren't heard in consultations and in other conversations around climate and environmental action, but also the issues you flagged around the conditions of accommodation and that the housing conditions that are experienced by members of the traveller community. It's well documented, it's well covered by the Irish Human Rights Commission and by the media, but it hasn't changed. And we haven't seen the sorts of changes and improvements that need to happen. So thank you again for sharing that. Austin, I'm going to come to you next, and perhaps you give us a little bit of an insight on the environmental injustices experienced by the community that you work with.
Great, thanks, Rose. I might go 30 seconds over on this and 30 seconds under on the other one. Sorry, I just timed myself. Yeah, so thanks for the apt question, and thanks for all of the really good work that the centre's completed over the last 12 months. I manage Robert Emmet CDP, we're a community development project in the Liberties, so in southwest inner city Dublin. We'd be based beside Oliver Bond Flats there for anybody who knows the area. And the local community will be subject to significant levels of environmental injustice across a variety of fields. And I'm using the word fields on purpose because the only way you will experience a field in Dublin 8 and the Liberties is when you use it as a turn of phrase, or if you visit Marrowbone Books and pick up a copy of John B. Keane's book, The Field, because there is no expanses of green space in the inner city, especially around the Liberties. There are no fields. So we recently delivered a collaborative project with UCD, also funded by the Irish Research Council, called Urban Grit. It was community led, so we empowered local community members to, I guess, gather the data. And yeah, we found there's 1.32 trees per person in the southwest inner city, which is in the lowest category citywide. I think we found there's about, and I don't have this figure in front of me, so I might be incorrect, about 0.7 square meters of green space per person in the area, again, which would be in the lowest category citywide. And I guess both of those are indicative of an environmental injustice relative to other areas of the city. There'd also be an environmental injustice in relation to the kind of built structures in the area. So there's an oversupply of facilities for transitory populations, acute facilities for transitory populations experiencing homelessness and substance dependency, and the polar opposite of these, facilities for transitory populations coming on holidays and studying in the area, so hotels and student accommodation. And this means that there's a high proportion of vulnerable individuals being placed in the area, which inevitably has attracted significant levels of antisocial behaviour and criminality that's further eroded the local environment and made people feel unsafe in their own community. And similarly, disproportionate levels of student accommodation hotels are in danger of creating a very different type of environmental injustice, in that they price and position the traditional community out of the area that they've lived in for generations. Disproportionately high levels of student and hotel accommodation also have a strange and unwelcome impact on where, and maybe just controversial, on where statutory funding is directed. So the 53 million in URDF funding received by Dublin City Council for the Dublin 8 area, I think it came in about a year ago, seems to be mainly focused on cosmetic projects such as street median improvements that serve to improve how the area looks and attract additional private investment into the area, which again probably only serves to further price and position the traditional community out of the area they've lived in for generations. I think we mentioned air quality earlier on. The air quality in Dublin 8 is quite poor, resulting from the high levels of traffic in the area. And it's an area with one of the lowest levels of car ownership per head of population nationally. There'd also appear to be higher than average instances of respiratory illness experienced by local community members, which would be caused or aggravated by poor air quality. There's also stark deficiency in appropriate resources for young people, and I know this is a point of concern for Minister O'Brien. I think I wrote to you a couple of months ago, who had raised concerns about the rezoning of football pitches in Skerries, and very correctly made the point about where would young people go if there's a lack of appropriate resources for them in their area. And I think that concern can be even more powerfully rephrased as to where they won't go if there aren't any appropriate resources in their area. Because young people who grow up in an area like southwest inner city Dublin without access to appropriate or healthy environment don't go to the same places as young people who grow up in appropriately resourced environments. And this can be seen in school completion rates and employment rates after school and across a variety of other data fields. I'm going to very briefly finish up. I've probably gone way over time. So that's some of the outdoor injustices. Recently, we delivered a survey of environmental conditions as they relate to people's housing. We did it initially in Oliver Bond House, and we're in the process of doing it across several other housing complexes in the inner city. But I'll just give you some headline figures. So 83% of residents in Oliver Bond House have significant damp and mold in their homes. 73% of people suffer from drafts and poor insulation. 35% have sewage issues. 30% of people have water ingress. 34% of people are impacted by pest infestations, so rats in their house. 65% of people are impacted by antisocial behaviour. And yeah, I think this would indicate that there is significant instances of environmental injustice in the southwest inner city. Sorry for going over time.
Thanks so much for that, Austin. And I think many of your observations, again, are echoed throughout the report, and indeed we're seeing them in our clinics in CLM, like the issue of access to green space, which is so critical for physical and mental health and the ability of people to grow their own food, is really absent from inner city areas. And I think your Urban Grit report echoes some of the findings of the Mapping Dublin report done a little while ago. But similarly, your points around air quality, I mean, I think that really highlights the environmental injustice issue, and that you have the lowest number of car ownership, and yet people who are the most affected by air quality from transport and other sources. And again, the issue of housing quality. I mean, our enjoyment of our environment starts with our home and the condition of our home. And if your home has really serious issues around access to sanitation, around pest issues, around damp, around mold, around sewage, then obviously your ability to enjoy your environment is really severely hampered. Mark, I'm going to come to you next. Mark, how does the environment impact our health, and how are such impacts distributed across different communities and groups?
Hi all, thanks Rose. First of all, thanks for the invitation to speak today. Austin kind of touched on there, like and you mentioned it, the green spaces, lack of green spaces and air pollution, how it impacts our health. Often and understandably, the climate crisis is viewed through the lens of environmental destruction and the level of carbon. Many of the public and some politicians unfortunately see it as a long-term crisis that doesn't really affect them in the immediate term, when in fact it really is a crisis for the here and now. But climate change and our environment and the way it's changing has a very real, direct and immediate impact upon our health. And unfortunately, it's often overlooked or dismissed as minimal. Our environment and the changes to it impacts upon our health in a myriad of ways. Probably the most direct and clear way in which the public might understand it is maybe environmental disasters such as flooding, storms, periods of drought or heat waves. And while here in Ireland, these are rare events, our changing climate means that these extreme events will become more frequent. In fact, Mediation has projected that more extreme, our weather become more extreme, meaning we can expect more frequent storms and floodings and more extreme summers, which might sound great, but that'll put certain vulnerable groups, such as the elderly, their health at risk. And looking at those extreme environmental impacts, heat waves can cause severe symptoms, particularly to vulnerable groups, just as those with chronic diseases, children and the elderly people, as I mentioned. Meanwhile, something like flooding, which is becoming more of a problem and projected to become more of a problem in Ireland, increases the risk of waterborne disease. And studies have actually shown that population groups and communities that are affected and displaced by flooding are associated with higher symptoms of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. So here we have a very clear example of how our environment impacts not only our physical, but also our mental health. And on the other hand, as Austin and it's been mentioned, the other obvious way that environment impacts upon our health is air pollution and water pollution. And especially on air pollution, we're learning more and more about it, how dangerous it is. The WHO updated their safe levels of air pollution just a while ago. And while here in Ireland, air quality is generally quite good due to the absence of large cities and heavy industry compared to other nations, we have a significant air pollution problem due to the burning of smoky solid fuels and our over-reliance on fossil fueled vehicles. It's been well documented by the media that air pollution is responsible for over 1,400 premature deaths per year in Ireland. A clear example of how our society's practices pollute our environment and damages all of our health. The cause of this is that a large proportion of Irish homes still rely on solid fuels to heat their homes, such as smoky coal, wet wood, and sod turf to heat their homes. And these forms of fuel release tiny microscopic particles called particulate matter that cause devastating health consequences, particularly to the cardiovascular system, but also on the respiratory, neurological, and fertility system. And while the new regulations that are coming into place next winter will effectively ban smoky coal and wet wood nationwide, will reduce those levels of particulate matter. Smokeless coal and dry wood will still be used to heat people's homes, because unfortunately that's all they have due to fuel poverty, which will emit high levels of particulate matter. And not only is it particulate matter from the burning of solid fuels damaging our health, but as Austin says, since we have a dominant car culture here in Ireland, and I think over 98% of our vehicles are fossil fuel based, meaning urban city centres have high levels of nitrogen dioxide, which is terrible for your respiratory health, particularly for children, pregnant women, and even their fetuses. And tragically, it's these children living in the most heavily polluted city centres that are most at risk. And sadly, like many other health indicators, and that's been mentioned before, it is the poorest and most vulnerable that are at most risk of air pollution and most often have lack of green spaces. Globally, the poorest and most disadvantaged are exposed to high levels of air pollution, but even here in Ireland, it's the same. Disadvantaged communities living in a city centre experience higher levels of air pollution, and throughout the country, those less well off who are most at risk, and this is really well documented in the video at the start, those less well off are most at risk of fuel poverty, meaning they rely on solid fuels to heat their homes, which isn't just damaging to their own health, but it goes out their chimney and it's damaging to their neighbours and the community health. So like many areas of climate and social justice, addressing climate change and cleaning our environment will bring a multitude of health benefits, but particularly for those most marginalized groups, which we really have to help more than anyone else, because they are most directly affected by the health impact of the environment. So thanks. I'll leave it at that for the first question.
Thanks so much for that, Mark. I think you highlight really well the disproportionate health impacts of environmental pollution and climate change on groups, either because of an underlying health condition, or because they're children who are more vulnerable to air pollution, as you say, or pregnant women, or because of the kind of healthcare that they can afford. And just to say, like, I think, like, you highlighted well, not just the physical consequences of kind of changing weather and pollution on people's physical health, but also mental health too. There's a really kind of important issue to address there. And on the air pollution issue, like, just to flag that there is a national clean air strategy consultation coming up. And I was interested to see, or to hear the Minister speak about the national energy poverty strategy, which is very long overdue. And I think actually it's really important that air quality and energy poverty be looked at in tandem, because one really does influence the other. But just moving on, Emer, to you, if you don't mind, do you feel the community you represent has a say in decisions that impact their environment? And by environment, I mean where they live, work and play.
Sure, so thanks very much. So I represent youth in this discussion, and for one more year, I'm technically still a youth myself, so I can speak both personally and collectively, but today I'll be speaking collectively. So do youth have a say in decisions that impact their environment? The answer to this is yes, but with an asterisk beside it, which I'll explain. There are many systems and mechanisms in place for young people to have their say on different aspects of their environment, from European youth dialogues to working with local county councils, voting in elections, do it ourselves activism, which is things like protests, joining local youth groups, parishes, emailing elected officials and so on. In fact, there are so many of these avenues that a group of young people I worked with in 2021 who were part of the Future Generations Project, which is a climate justice project in NYCI, they developed a resource with us titled How to Create Change at the Local Level. And the resource identifies over 15 different ways that young people can get involved in their locality in whatever capacity they wish to do so. If anybody would like a copy of the resource, it's free to download. I'll pop the link in the chat there. And that was an entirely youth-written, youth-led resource creation as well. So the short answer is yes, there are ways that young people can have a say in decisions that impact their environment, but there is that asterisk that I mentioned, which I'd like to touch on briefly. So when we were creating this resource, it became apparent that most of the ways young people can get involved depends solely on the dedication of the young person themselves. It depends on that young person putting themselves forward into a situation where they can give their opinion. And while we want and love to see young people actively engaging in their local democratic process, there are also some issues with this. There are many young people who are just not comfortable putting themselves forward in this capacity. Perhaps a disability prevents them from joining a certain club or organization. Perhaps they are introverted. Perhaps they are disillusioned with the democratic process or don't trust that their say will really make a difference politically. For whatever reason, attention needs to be given to involving young people who are not at the table, particularly those who are most vulnerable or marginalized, who we often see being left out of decision-making conversations. So the process at the moment for young people to feed into policy or matters that happen in their locality is very convenient for the policymakers, as youth essentially come to them. But I'd argue that one, this isn't really good enough, and two, it's not really getting an accurate snapshot of youth if you're only using the ones that are most vocal. Young people are not univocal. There is as much diversity in young people and their opinions as there is in the rest of the human population. So while yes, young people do have avenues to have their say on their local environment, the process still needs to be much more inclusive.
Thank you so much, Emer, and thank you for sharing that resource in the chat box. And I think, again, you raised a really interesting point about the importance of ensuring that any kind of consultation is really genuinely inclusive and really tries to reach out into communities that maybe haven't traditionally participated as much. Sive, I'm going to come to you now. What does the research say about how environmental injustices are measured and experienced across Ireland?
Thanks very much, Rose, and thanks to all the other panelists. I've really enjoyed listening to everyone. I suppose what sparked this research project was a kind of sense that there was very little information and data out there, and that it was necessary to do a scoping exercise to find out who's doing what and what kind of reports and data sets are out there and can they be brought together. So the first thing to say is that environmental justice is not a concept that's used in public policy. It's not defined in law anywhere, and nor is climate justice actually. So that means that from a point of view of monitoring and measuring, it's not really anybody's responsibility. So that's a clear weakness to start with. Having said that, there is quite a lot of literature out there internationally about how to go about this kind of exercise, and quite comprehensive reports have been done at national level and at local level as well. You know, in the Netherlands and Scotland and in a variety of countries, and especially in the United States where the kind of movement originated. But just from the point of view of Ireland, like most people, I got my census form there the other night. And the census is a really critical way that the state collects information about household size, type of housing people live in, commuting patterns, and what else is there? Health conditions. There's a lot of information that's collected, including about heating type and types of cars and transport modes that are used. And this information has been collated for many, many years by Pubble and turned into a local index that's used as a deprivation index. So we have lots of information in Ireland about exactly where, you know, socially marginalized communities live and what the conditions are that make them so, whether in terms of income or employment status or housing type and so on and so forth. But what we don't have is that information linked to environmental quality data. And when you look at the environmental quality data, it's often quite difficult to understand. The EPA has a huge website with lots of data on it, but it's hard for communities to use this information. They've been telling us for years that certain, you know, media like air and water quality indicators are going downhill rapidly. But if you were to go looking for information about your local air quality, it can be quite tricky to find that. So what we need is a way in which to make the information that's out there about environmental quality linked to local area and deprivation indices. So we have quite a lot of recommendations about that, and a long discussion in the report of the different types of deprivation indexes that exist in Ireland and how they might be expanded. But the important thing as well is to say that there's a slight, I don't even want to say bias, but a sort of a tendency, shall we say, within the social justice research community to narrow the understanding and definition of social justice to issues like income and other measures of deprivation. So there's an interesting academic exercise and conversation to be had about expanding our understanding of inequality to include environmental measures, and especially to be able to link to particular kinds of communities that might not all be living in the same place. So one of the dimensions of environmental justice is the idea of recognition, that some people experience environmental injustice, not because of where they live, but because of who they are and because of their collective identity, whether they are migrants, whether they're members of the traveling community, and so on. So these things can determine, or your cultural identity can determine how you experience the environment more than your geographical location, or that they might be linked in a kind of intersectional way. So basically, we're looking at questions of expanding the understanding of social justice or social injustice, and also looking at it in a kind of intersectional way, or a kind of a sense of compound injustice. And in fact, one of the authors that we refer to talks about a triple jeopardy, where people, and you know, Austin's example, and then when Mark was explaining about the impacts of poor air quality on health, kind of capture this idea perfectly, that you have poor air quality affecting communities that are more vulnerable than most, because of the absence of green space, poor housing conditions, and they don't even create the pollution themselves, and yet they're more vulnerable and less well able to cope and less well able to advocate for themselves because of other forms of exclusion in the public policy process. So I'll stop there just to say that there was a lot of issues mentioned there by the Minister and by other panelists that I wish we'd had time to cover in more depth in the report: food justice and you know, climate change more broadly. And there was another issue that came up. Oh yeah, the mental health point as well. They're brilliant areas for further work, but we just didn't have the time to cover everything in detail. So hopefully we'll get to that at some future date. Thanks, Rose.
Thanks, Hive, and hopefully other people will too. I mean, that was one of the aims of this research, that hopefully it would be, well, it'd be there to highlight the gaps, but also as a springboard for further research. And as you say, there's a real lack of data in this area, and there are mechanisms in place through the census and other ways of maybe trying to measure that in the future. And as you say, also, you know, we don't have a definition of climate justice, and that was something that came up a lot around the climate bill and now the Climate Act, the fact that there isn't a definition of climate justice in the bill, and previously a weak definition proposed. So that's something that's important too. And as you say, the difficulty in accessing information, it's not always easy to find out information on your local environment, and not always easy for communities to navigate what seems like a very complex area. And that's something, again, that we're finding more and more through our clinic, people just not having access to that basic information, which is a protected right under the Aarhus Convention. It's something that really should be looked at being strengthened and resourced even further. Rosaleen, I'm going to come back to you now and just ask you a question about accountability, because accountability is a really important aspect of environmental justice. I mean, there's no point in having laws that aren't being implemented. So have you any thoughts on what needs to be done to better ensure accountability around environmental obligations or environmental justice obligations?
Rose, I did say earlier I wasn't going to ask or respond to a second question because of time. However, you asked, and I will answer. But before that, I am really disappointed that the report doesn't name disabled people in this. And really, you know, I know you can't just say there are vulnerable groups. We're 1 in 4 of the population are higher, and climate change does affect us in a particular way. So I would ask you and others to make contact with the Center for Independent Living, and there's a load of young disabled activists who are ready and willing to give you the information around climate change and disability that would have fitted in your report. So that's one thing. And what was your question?
Just around accountability, Rosaleen, that we have all these laws, but if they're not being implemented, there's really no point in them. So how do we ensure better accountability?
Rose, you're talking to a traveller activist who has seen a whole plethora of laws, reports, recommendations, and they've never been implemented. And I'm not always sure it's not about resources or lack of resources. I think maybe one of your speakers said earlier, Mark, about we don't see climate justice as an immediate issue. We see it further down the line, and somehow we don't always feel we have a responsibility to our current generation, let alone our generations to come. I know Mary Robinson talked passionately, was it about 5 years ago, about having only a matter of 9 or 10 years to sort this issue out. I'm sure those 9 years are now reduced to 4 or 5. We've seen very obvious changes by weather shifts. But I also think that education and the minister talked about a two-pronged approach that has to start at education level with our children and our schools, but also implementing policy and law really does require a paradigm shift in how and who we vote for, and ensuring that our legislators and politicians have climate change at the heart of their mission and ambition in politics. Is that okay?
Thanks, Rosaleen. Thanks so much. And sorry for coming back at you again. And as you rightly say, there's lots that isn't in the report. And I think Sive mentioned that too. The report is really just the start of a conversation that we hope will be continued by many others.
I know, but Rose, I mean, what happened in Glasgow really highlighted how removed disabled people are from the zeitgeist and the organizers and the activists in climate change. They seem to don't consider us, and they blame us for causing damage because of the materials we use in our everyday living. So I do think a dialogue is really urgently needed. And also I would say, you and the rest of your brother, don't be afraid to name disabled people. Vulnerable groups doesn't really cover anyone. We're all vulnerable, you know, but you need to name travelers and disabled people, not just lump us in undervulnerable. Thanks again.
Thanks so much for that, Rosaleen. Emer, I'm going to come to you next. How can we ensure that youth-led movements are included in environmental decision making?
Oh, I love this question because it's one that I can answer very simply, and I mean very, very much what I say. The answer is just invite them. Invite them, full stop. Young people want to be included, even those that I mentioned earlier that might not be comfortable putting themselves forward to be involved. But if you are the one actively reaching out to youth saying, we want your opinion, no, you know what, we need your opinion, young people will answer that call. So that resource that I sent earlier, and thanks so much, Sive, I didn't cop that I posted it just to the host and the panelists, but I'll put it back in the chat again to everyone. There is an activity in that resource on page 13 that's about mapping your locality. And we did this with the frame of mind of youth trying to form collaborations within their own local community and identifying, you know, those target audiences for them. But it can also be just as beneficial an activity for adults or those in youth or community work or policy or otherwise that are trying to engage young people in decision making. So look through the resource at all of the different avenues for young people to get involved and find those centres or organisations within your own community that have youth involved already and reach out to them. Call or email and say, hello, my name is Emer from NYCI. We're in the planning stages of a new programme that we believe will directly impact young people. Therefore, we would like to consult a panel of youth before we dive into the project or submit this application or start writing this policy, whatever it is. Would you have some young people that would be interested in giving their opinion? Or is there a youth worker that I can contact to see if their group would like to be involved? It's really as simple as making those calls and those emails and inviting young people to have, and this is very important, an equal seat at the table. And I really can't stress enough how important it is to bring young people into the conversation as early as possible. If you've already designed something without including youth and then bring in a young person to approve of what you have worked so hard on doing, they're not going to feel comfortable, especially if they don't know you, turning around and saying that your project is bad. That's meaningless and tokenistic, and we don't want anybody just checking a box to say, yep, I've engaged youth. We want youth actively engaged from the get-go. As Dr. Rosaline said so wonderfully, that we need to look at our current generations. This is no longer a future issue, it is a current issue, and young people are alive today and are being affected today. Finally, I want to point out how utterly incredible young people are at being at decision-making tables. They have a whole different perspective of the world that is not tarnished by funders or funding, organizational rivalries, or whatever else. They are inherently passionate when given the opportunity and the space to be passionate. To give you one final example, on top of the wonderful resource that I put in the chat there that the Future Generations young people created, they also created Ireland's and possibly even Europe's first ever climate justice charter. Sive O'Neill pointed out that there is no climate justice or environmental justice listed in policy. Well, the young people said no to that and have created essentially their own mini policy on this. It's a flexible piece of policy that they are asking organisations across Ireland to sign up to. And it's kind of to embed climate justice principles within the workplace, from the board of directors or whatever the decision-making body is, down to interns and young people that work with the organisation or are part of the organisation. It's a fantastic, important and entirely youth-led initiative that came out of just letting young people be creative and critically assess what is important to them. So I'll put the link to the charter in the chat also if any of you would like to read about it, or even better, sign up to it. But I promise you that if you simply invite young people into a decision-making space, they will impress you, no doubt about it. And if any of you would like to get in contact with young people but don't know how, I'll also leave my email in the chat. Feel free to reach out to me anytime. But thank you again to everybody at CLM for creating this wonderful report. It really is beneficial to everybody, I think. So thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Emer. I think that was a great example of the passion you were just talking about. And I loved the simplicity of your answer. I mean, just invite them, but invite them early on and in a meaningful way so that it doesn't just feel like a box ticking exercise, which is something that came out really strongly in the report, that people just feeling this real fatigue around consultations and reports, which are here today to launch. But this experience that you're just there to consult and nothing happens out of it, no change happens. So like that meaningful participation where people really feel their voices are heard and their concerns are taken into account. Austin, I'd like to come to you next, please. Perhaps you could give me your thoughts on how policymakers can ensure that everyone has a voice and is supported to have a voice, importantly, in decision-making, environmental decision-making.
Yeah, I think that's what it's all about. Yeah, like from representing the Southwest Inner City community, representing a community that faces kind of considerable environmental injustices, I think it's all about giving people a voice and making sure that they have the confidence to express that voice. And the Minister earlier on named a number of kind of platforms that already exist, and I guess are quite, they're good, they exist, they're based on best practice and all of that. But sometimes it's not just about the platforms, it's about the culture, the accessibility of those platforms to people. So I think there's the public participation networks, or PPNs, which include environmental colleges at the moment. There's local environmental networks, citizens' assemblies, there's the environmental pillar. And And then there's obviously all of the different consultations that would take place in relation to individual projects. But like, are they accessible? I think probably not culturally accessible to community members in Southwest Inner City Dublin. And if they aren't accessible, for all of their goodwill and all of their being based in instances of best practice, like, are they any more than a box ticking exercise? Or if it's only people from certain social or geographic classes that are accessing them, then any data or whatever comes out of the platforms that exist will only represent their interests and will almost further marginalize the people who aren't accessing them. Yeah, so accessibility and ensuring that everyone has a voice and is comfortable using it is all about culture. It's about how people are made to feel, and policymakers will always have huge difficulties in making people feel a certain way because they're at such a removed, from people. And it's obviously very difficult to program culture. Culture is the outcome of a huge patchwork of factors. So I have seen some culture changes on like very individual or very small group levels brought about by the actions of individual policymakers or people in senior policy related positions. And one of them was actually really enjoyable. It's so the report that I cited earlier on, myself and a couple of members of Oliver Bond Residence Group went to the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission headquarters and had the opportunity to meet with Sinead Gibney, the Chief Commissioner. And she arrived early, she made the tea, she made like the biscuits, gave them to Oliver Bond Residence Group members. And everybody was like 10 feet tall. Everybody felt fantastic. Everybody felt valued. And after that, I think the input into that consultation across the complex that led to that report, we had like about maybe 20% participation. And there was a number of factors that changed in between. But the next survey we did, we had 49% participation because people felt valued. But like Michal Martin came, like a lot of senior people got involved, but people felt valued and people felt that they were being listened to. I think, yes, it's all about culture. In terms of creating culture, I think what Minister O'Brien said was right. It's all about making sure this is grassroots and bottom up, and he's done really good stuff in increasing SciCap funding by 10%. He also allowed the development of a couple of small pilot projects within the SciCap funding as well. And this allows like small grassroots organizations to design programs that kind of create a culture that will allow people to be at the table who otherwise wouldn't be at the table. Because I think policy is at such a distance, and like inputting into policy is at such a distance from a lot of people's lives, that there kind of has to be something in between. And an example of something that we do in Robert Emmet CDP, we've been able, through tiny increase in funding, to establish an inner city beekeeping project. And now we employ a number of beekeepers. We have 125 beehives across the inner city. We deliver free beekeeping classes. We're working with the University of Cardiff to do pollen analysis on our honey, which shows up what type of plants the bees are accessing, and by extension, what type of plants are growing in the inner city. We're working with Tyndall Laboratories and a digital hub to develop little sensors that are on the beehives which monitor air quality locally, as well as stuff about, bee health. But again, that can be extended out into the health of the environment for the local human population. But the people who are engaging in the project are local community members, and we're having fun walking around wearing beekeeping suits around the inner city. It's creating jobs, it's creating real benefits. And now, whenever there's any consultations, people feel confident enough to get involved, and people have that platform to jump off to get involved in policy making and all of that. So yeah, it's I think it's really it's really about resourcing local community development projects and local geographically located organizations who can kind of act as a conduit to the community.
Thanks, Austin, for those examples. I couldn't agree more with you. And I think you've given just really brilliant examples of when it's done well and how it can be done well. And there's real lessons to be learned from that, and about creating that culture and making people feel valued. So I think there's a lot to be learned from those positive examples of how it has worked well. I'm coming to you now, Mark, and I'm just conscious of the time. Could you give us your views on how we can ensure that environmental concerns feature more prominently within the health sector and health policy?
Yeah, of course. Just a word of warning. I've been getting warnings that my Zoom connection is unstable, just in case I freeze in the middle of talking. Well, there are many ways in which environmental concerns can feature more prominently. On a slightly related but unrelated note, as the HSE is one of the largest employers in the state and has a large portfolio of buildings and vehicles, it is a significantly large carbon footprint. So just on the first of all, like, it's imperative that they put in immediate and actual concrete plans to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, both for the sake of public health and for Ireland to meet its climate targets. Addressing the question more directly, however, I think environmental health issues needs to be incorporated into healthcare professional training, whether it's trained to be a nurse, a doctor, or any healthcare profession. It is critical that these professionals are educated on how the environment impacts upon our health, and what can be done from both a patient's and professional's perspective to address these environmental health issues. For professionals already working in the sector, similar ongoing training can and should be delivered. So it's not just junior doctors and nurses coming through with the knowledge. We know the devastating health consequences that the environment can have, so it's pretty critical that our entire healthcare professions need to take it seriously. That would allow for example, GPs to talk to their patients about how environmental factors can affect their health, so that if they have a chronic health issue, such as a cardiovascular health problem, then the GPs can advise them when might be the best time for them to take their exercise, such as their daily walk. But also, as healthcare professionals are hugely respected here and around the world, particularly after the pandemic, the public really listen to what their nurses and doctors are saying. And in fact, ahead of the COP26, an open letter was signed by 600 organizations representing 46 million nurses, doctors, and healthcare workers around the world. And that was sent to delegates, warning that the climate crisis is the single biggest health threat facing humanity, and called on world leaders to deliver on climate action. So if healthcare professionals are really campaigning for environmental and on climate change for health reasons, the public will follow because they really respect those professions. One of the best real life examples that I've seen of environmental issues featuring more prominently within the healthcare sector by the Irish Doctors for the Environment, who just do amazing work, and Temple Street Hospital. I'm not sure if it's actually been implemented or not, but they've planned a project whereby the TV monitors in the lobby of the hospital that show maybe the daily weather forecast would also show levels of air pollution in the vicinity. And these air quality forecasts will indicate the level of air pollution in the area, and how spikes in certain levels of air pollution can be damaging to health or put certain population groups at risk. And in fact, I think the EPA is actually in discussion with Mediation to include air quality into their daily weather forecasts, so that there's sort of a great effect on informing the public on pollution levels and how they affect their health. And I really think it's important that when the HSE and the Department of Health is coming up with healthcare policy, that they do it in tandem with the Department of Health, the Department of Environment, and the EPA, so that future health policy does take into account of the environment and the environmental impact on health. So there are many ways and examples that environmental concerns can feature more prominently, not only in the health sector and health policy, but also in our day-to-day public realm, through simple steps like the daily weather forecast with air pollution monitors or bulletins. So that there's many ways it can happen.
Thanks, Mark. Lots of great insights in there, and lots of ambassadors, as you mentioned. Like, I'm sure the Climate and Health Alliance are great ambassadors in this area, but also, as you mentioned, the Irish Doctors for the Environment, who do really great work.
Yeah.
I'm coming to you, Si, for the final question, the final say for today. How should environmental justice be addressed in the planning process?
Thanks, Rose. Well, it would almost be better if you were the one answering this question. CLM contributed a lot of very important recommendations in relation to procedural justice and how we might improve that in the planning process and in decision making generally. The first thing to say is that we have recommended guidelines on environmental justice that should be adopted by the EPA, Bord and local authorities or planning authorities, so that they kind of understand what it is they're supposed to look at. And, you know, if we're wanting them to use a justice lens, we have to describe that to them and give them some guidance. And there is an interesting example of that in the US, actually, where the US EPA has quite a comprehensive set of guidelines for our environmental decision-making bodies. They're not mandatory, but they are very good guidelines. The second thing is that there's no mention, as we referred to earlier, of environmental justice in some key policy documents and legislation. For instance, the Climate Action Plan we've identified as having the potential to do lots of good, but because it's not doing it in the pursuit of environmental justice, some of those key impacts, both positive and negative, might get missed or sidelined. And this is something that could easily be addressed if there was a national policy. Now, the EPA itself has been calling for a national environmental policy statement. And I suppose we could recommend that environmental justice be part of that. And that makes it clear then what the state's position is. And then that, you know, ripples throughout the different agencies and their activity. But just to come back to the key thing that CLM was, you know, arguing and advocating for all along through the debate about the climate law and also subsequently, is that the planning system is in theory open to public participation. It's quite clear that you can make comments. But over the years, this has become bogged down with various levels of barriers in terms of fees being introduced, difficulties that communities experience in making their voices heard. And once you get to the point of decision-making past in Bord Pleanála, it starts to get extremely litigious and expensive. And in fact, an EU commissioner was in Ireland recently, highlighting the fact that Ireland is the most expensive member state in which to make claims, environmental claims, before the courts. So there's no civil legal aid that supports in ENGOs or community groups. You have to be an individual rather than a group. And that means that it's extremely difficult for communities to take actions in defense of their local environment. And so what you see is that it's the kind of more established environmental organizations that are able to do this. And it creates the impression that they're doing it not with community interests at heart, when in fact it's really that there are enormous barriers, you know, to taking environmental cases before the courts, where a lot of them end up going. So addressing that would make a huge difference. I noticed that Cliona Kimber is here actually in our audience. And Cliona, as a member of the Climate Bar Association, they produced an amazing set of recommendations recently, which we've incorporated into the report, recommending for a kind of a whole new environmental court. And as someone, and along with Claude Daly, who was involved in taking Ireland's climate case all the way to the courts, we experienced the difficulties in taking that kind of case and the difficulties that are there for ordinary groups, especially community groups from representing disadvantaged and marginalized communities. The final thing I would just say is that what is really critical here is the advocacy piece. So you can see when you resource community groups like Austin's, you know, and Emer's organizations and so on, the examples they were giving are just amazing. So when groups have the capacity to take these issues on as projects or as campaigns, or develop resource materials for their members, change happens. But we have to build capacity. We have to resource the likes of CLM properly. We have to resource the different community groups that work with vulnerable communities. And as you say, Rosaline, that is very amorphous term. But we've tried to define it a little bit in the report, to, you know, to try to capture the different aspects of disadvantage that might be relevant here. But of course, we all, through our lives, step in and out of those categories, and they're fluid categories by definition as well. But I think the advocacy piece is really important, because the political system is quite allergic to instrumentalizing concepts of injustice or social injustice, environmental justice, climate justice. So we experienced that in the debates about the Climate Act, that, the definition you would get if you wanted to put climate justice in the legislation was so vague and weak as to explicitly dodge the very idea of connecting social inequality and environmental inequality. So, so there's a big piece of work there to get public representatives to really champion this idea, and that falls to kind of civil society and community groups to push for that. But in order for that to happen, we need to be confident about what we're talking about. So hopefully this resource will help give the tools to people to advocate for environmental justice. And we have a lot to learn from each other, and this work is by no means finished today.
Thanks so much, Saib. I'd echo everything you just said. And I think one of the issues is there is a fear of being held to account. And so as a result, not wanting to put anything in legislation which makes it easier to challenge decision makers and those who have obligations who don't meet their obligations, and holding them to account. And as you say, there was an excellent paper produced by Cliona Kimber and the Climate Bar Association around the need for an environmental court along the New South Wales model, which has this broad access to justice and broad standing rights and flexible rules around costs. And we do need our civil legal aid to be better, because it's too risky, it's too difficult at the moment for community organisations and small environmental groups to take, and even bigger environmental groups to take actions before the court. And another thing just to say really quickly here is the government is actually trying to restrict access to justice at the moment. There is a Housing and Planning and Development Bill currently before the Joint Interactive Committee, and that's actually trying to restrict, stated restriction, access to courts in planning matters. And planning is so inextricably linked with the enjoyment of our environment, and there are so many environmental injustices that are tied up with planning. So the idea of restricting individuals and communities' access to courts in planning matter is really abhorrent, and it's totally against the idea of environmental justice. Look, I've really enjoyed the conversation and the discussion here today, and I'm afraid just time isn't on our side and I'll have to draw to a close. But I think a lot of the points that were raised by all the panelists, I've learned a lot from them, but I think they just really bolster the recommendations in the report, this need for further research to understand the link between social deprivation and environmental equality, and also that need to ensure that information, participation, access to justice, the rights that are guaranteed under the Aarhus Convention are genuinely strengthened and resourced rather than restricted and threatened. And these recommendations and others in the report will help with that last recommendation of ensuring that climate, energy and environmental policies are equality and poverty proofed. So I'd like to just close this event by firstly thanking the Irish Research Council for funding the project, but I'd also like to thank everyone who worked on the project, to Diarmid, to Saib, to Coit Gleeson, to Sinead Mercier, who all worked on, and Charlotte Bishop, who all worked on the report and on the workshop, to Clodagh Daly, to Owen Wheelhan, to Adam May, who worked on the community resources, and to Liz Devine, who organised the event today. I'm also really grateful to the Minister for his time, and to our panellists for their time and their insights, to Rosaline, to Austin, to Mark, Emer, and to Saib again, for contributing really to such an enlightening discussion today. And finally, I'd like to thank you all for attending and for contributing to the chat in the chat box. The executive summary, the full report and the community resources are all available on CLM's website. Please use them, please share them, please build on them. Thank you so much and have a good day.